Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. It's been a busy day here, so I'd like to thank you if you've come to a repeat event. Hope we can help you celebrate International Women's Day. Thanks for coming on to celebrate it with us. My name is Rafael Epstein. I'm on ABC Radio in the afternoons. Eliza Griswold is here to tell us about the 10th parallel. I'd like to thank everybody who helped organise the evening, including the Wheeler Centre. We're going to go for a good hour. Towards the end, there'll be a chance for you guys to ask any questions you like of Eliza about the book or anything else, and we'll see how we go. Eliza, welcome to Melbourne.
Thank you, Rafael.
I know you've been to a few different cities in Australia, so we're glad to have people come all the way out from where you've come from. One of the things that kept occurring to me, actually, when I read this, is why on earth did you go to such trouble? Because most of the reporting on these parts of the world are written by people who don't spend as long there and don't do things that are as dangerous as the things that you did. So why go to that effort?
Well, so the book, the reason to write this book really began just before September 11th in 2000, when I became an independent journalist. And the first stories I found myself writing about were about honor crimes, women who are killed by family members for perceived crimes against their honor, including rape. And in the course of doing that story, I learned that, you know, for his time, Muhammad set down the most progressive legal codes for women in history, including, you know, the women had the right to hold property, no more killing your girl babies, and women had the right to divorce. And that understanding of Islam and Islam vis-a-vis human rights certainly stood me in good stead and made me extremely curious before the events of September 11th, where I was in New York and started reporting. And there's a whole generation of reporters like me who just 2 weeks later were in Pakistan with the same sneakers on from the World
What was
Trade
your
Center.
understanding like of how Islam and religion featured in these sorts of societies? Where were you at in September 2001?
Well, you know, I come from a religious background. Now, it's a progressive religious background. My dad recently retired from being what is the head of the Anglican Church in the United States, the Episcopal Church. He's called the presiding bishop. So I grew up in this sort of mystical, like, kumbaya singing.
Guitars on Sunday mornings.
You got it. Crop, hunger walk, a lot of, you know, work around poverty, understanding of Christianity. But my upbringing made these questions of faith and intellect very, very prevalent. And so when September 11th happened, and there was certainly among a lot of the people I wrote for, this kind of, well, none of this has anything to do with religion, and what is Islam anyway, and it's just all about poor people. I came from a background where I felt comfortable talking to people on either sides of this divide, and I knew already the single factor that 4 out of 5 of the world's nearly 2 billion Muslims don't live in the Middle East. They live in Africa and they live in Asia. So I wanted to travel geographically to where they meet nearly half the world's 2 billion Christians on the ground, over 9,000 miles. So I thought, you know, I stand in a pretty good position to debunk some of this overblown and oversimplified clash of civilizations narrative that was particularly popular in America. And so that took me 7 years, but that's what I tried to do.
So the book is written, you were telling me before when we were talking back there, you're writing over 7 years, you're going to a whole lot of different places, reporting for a whole lot of different magazines. When did you fall on the common theme of the 10th parallel, and why did you choose it?
So when I began reporting the book, thinking about what am I going to write about, I thought I was going to write about undercover evangelical missionaries in the Muslim world. And right before the Iraq War started, I went to Iraq, like many of my colleagues, and I started hanging out with an American woman who was proselytizing undercover, but publicly she was teaching math. And we did things like, you know, she would go to the top of of the roof and pray with other undercover missionaries that every minaret would become a cross. But that's all she was doing. The rest of what she was doing was teaching math. And I realized pretty quickly that to write about a handful of Westerners in the Muslim world as the confrontation between Christianity and Islam was completely misguided. Not only would it place people like Janet in extreme peril for doing little, whatever her intention was, practically what she was doing every day was teaching math. And I did run into, when I started thinking about, this book is really about Africans and Africans, Asians and Asians, and when I started really thinking about it along the 10th parallel, I went to Sudan with Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son and head of a nearly $1 billion evangelical empire. And Franklin was going for the first time in history to the North Sudan. Now, Sudan is split between North and South along the 10th parallel, and we now have the world's newest country, Southern Sudan, that lies to the south of the 10th parallel. That is no accident. That is partly the geography of where the dry north of Africa meets the wetter sub-Saharan south, and because those two kinds of geography meet there, so do the two religions. And that's because Islam reached most of North Africa first, and the missionaries and traders who carried the faith peacefully over the northernmost third of the country, of the continent, they rode their camels and their horses through the desert. Well, when they reached the 10th parallel, where the south, the wetter south began, so too did tsetse flies. And the tsetses killed off the camels and the horses that the traders and missionaries were using, and that's where Islam stopped. So when you look at Sudan now, you see this divide along the 10th parallel between the Muslim north and the Christian and non-Christian south. And yeah.
Oh no, look, I'm just curious. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
yeah.
One of my favourite books is by a bloke called Jared Diamond,
yes.
Guns, Germs and Steel, which is effectively a geographic explanation for why white people seem to conquer so much of the world. I wondered how much you think the geography is a crucial part of the various conflicts. Geography is one of the most crucial elements of our world today, and we discount it because our world is so virtual. So essentially, Christianity and Islam meet where they do in this band just north of the equator, across 9,000 miles, most of Africa and most of Asia, for a very particular reason. This is where, before geography, two kinds of weather meet there: dry, warm air dropping from the northern hemisphere and wet, warm air rising from the south collide along the equator. They form what's called the intertropical convergence zone. Now, this zone creates what are called Hadley cells, and as climate change intensifies along this area all over the world, so too do the extreme weather events near the equator. So we see extreme drought, we see extreme flooding. Both of these get rolled right into religious conflict. Now, these storms spin westward off the coast of Africa at Cape Verde. They cross the Atlantic Ocean through the doldrums, and if they succeed and survive, they hit the east coast of the United States as hurricanes. So our weather links us to one. Our weather is a form of globalization, and religion, like the weather, links us to one another whether we like it or not. So I think what we'll see increasingly, and certainly a lot of the conflicts in Sudan especially, but in Nigeria and Somalia and Ethiopia as well, that look on the surface like fights between Christianity and Islam, are largely driven by these cataclysmic weather events which are intensifying. Look, I do want to ask you about whether or not and in what ways religion is a proxy for other conflicts. But the other thing that, you even mentioned this back there as well, that I also kept thinking about, you very casually and in a quite small way talk about, the car got shot up, and, we just dodged a car bomb, and you're talking about how you nearly died in Nigeria. Why put yourself under such risk? What's driving you to ignore that dangers to your own life?
Well, there's a particular kind of journalism. The book does not get into too many kind of rah-rah danger moments, and that's partly because a couple of weeks ago we lost the best woman correspondent doing this work on the face of the planet, Mary Colvin. This woman, as I'm sure you guys know, had one eye. She wore an eye patch because she lost an eye, which was shot out when she was reporting in Sri Lanka with the Tamil Tigers. She is just the finest journalist imaginable, and in extreme danger a lot of the time, and very rarely did she write about her own experience, because the idea of the cult of the journalist, which I might get in trouble for saying this, but is a particularly American...
Particularly male.
On International Women's Day, I think we could say that. Probably this idea that the story is somehow about the journalist is repellent to me. And so that's a little bit of a background of why there are many things that happen in the course of doing this reporting I don't write too much about.
But why endure it?
Why endure it? Because people live there. And yes, the correspondent faces, a day of risk, and people living along this fault line face a lifetime of risk that not only they, but their children are going to have to endure after them. And we have a responsibility to know what's going on in this world, and so that's the work that I feel called to do.
One of the ways that I often think about, I suppose, a lot of the conflicts that the Australian military is involved in, it's a kind of a new version of the Cold War. So you've got your hot conflict like Vietnam in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and you've got your proxy, hidden, secret conflicts. So Laos now becomes places like Somalia. But the more I read the book, the more you realise how that kind of a simple way of looking at it can obscure things. And I have to admit, if I read things about Somalia, or if I read things about even, there are a lot of Australian police in places like Indonesia.
Oh, yeah.
I think about it very much from that simplified Cold War sort of frame of mind. What are you trying to get to in the book? In what ways are you trying to break down that model of looking at the conflict?
The most important kinds of religious struggle today are not those between Christianity and Islam. They are those inside of Christianity and Islam. And frequently what happens with these power struggles between moderates and extremists, whether they are inside of Christianity or they're inside of Islam, extremists in either pole will demonize the other. That we hear a lot of talk. I mean, people die when an American cuckoo in Florida says he's going to burn the Quran. People do physically die in Kabul, in Afghanistan, or also, after the Danish cartoon riots, more people died in Nigeria than in any other country. So essentially, I think what we need to understand is how religion has come to be such an important identity, more so than ethnicity or nationality, which is superimposed in many places. Now, there is a parallel to the Cold War, which I feel is pretty important, which is in many of the places where the Soviet Union and the U.S. faced off tacitly, especially in Africa. That tacit war was also the greatest source of international support and funding. So take Somalia, for example. You have this vacuum where no longer are the Soviets and the U.S. playing off one another. And so what happens? Well, suddenly, not unlike what happened in Afghanistan and along the AfPak border, when the U.S. is no longer facing the Soviets and loses interest in supporting a particular population, their allies, the Saudis, do remain behind. And so a refugee camp that was run with American boots and Saudi education, without the American boots, is still run by the Saudis. That has become both in Somalia, and obviously we see this more, we see it more prevalently because we know more.
And does religion become the fault line because it's all that is left when you degrade a society and when you don't have civic society, when you don't have proper proper public service, those sorts of things? Does religion just become the proxy battleground because it's the easiest thing for a culture to retain if everything else is degraded?
Religion...
Or does it have its own power?
So, first of all, I never once in, how many, 8 countries and 7 years and thousands of miles of reporting, I never once saw a religious conflict that didn't have a worldly or secular trigger to it. So in Sudan, people fought over oil. They fought over water. So from west to east, the countries I traveled in, Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, in every one of these where religion had become a source of conflict, the trigger, the blow point had something to do with land, oil, water. In Indonesia, chocolate. When the principal ingredient in chocolate, cacao, prices spiked in eastern Indonesia, so too did violence between Christians and Muslims. So political elections, population growth, all of these were interlinked with religion as sources of conflict. Now, people would like to say, it would be easy to say, well, isn't all conflict secular? It has nothing to do with religion. And unfortunately, that's too simple. Because I do think what you're alluding to, and that's exactly right, is especially in colonial, post-colonial societies where nationhood was a joke to begin with, arbitrary lines drawn on a colonial map. Take Nigeria. Nigeria is America's 5th largest oil supplier, and yet the majority of Nigerians live on less than $2 a day. 1 out of 7 Africans comes from Nigeria. And so if the state is absent from your life, or rapacious, which frequently in many countries like Nigeria, for most Nigerians, the state's a problem. So the state's not giving you a road, no clean water, no education, no job, nothing. So what do you turn to? What collective identity do you turn to to ensure your rights? More and more people turn to religion, certainly over nationality, but even over ethnicity and even over race. Because as I was saying before, this global linkage. I am important because I am a Christian and I am linked to this tradition in the West, or I am linked to this Islamic faith and this Islamic history. These are the sources people turn to for empowerment increasingly.
But it's not really religion that perhaps you grew up with or I grew up with, as the example of the Muslim herder who's got the cross on his cheek, and then there's the example of I think he's a tribal leader in Indonesia who's just converted his old tribe because that was the simplest and most profitable thing to do. The religion isn't really the sort of spiritual or ethical construct that we perceive it to be, is it? It's actually this real mishmash of local influences.
What a careful reader you are, Rafael.
That's right.
I think... Okay, so when I began the book, to some degree, come from and the book's a collection of stories, because I don't really feel as a journalist there's such a thing as objective truth. I think there are a series of subjectivities, and my own is one. So when I set out, I did to some degree think, well, I'm going to travel to where there have been places of great violence, and I'm going to be able to explain why people believe what they do. To some degree, I definitely had that prejudice myself without really understanding that I did. And in the course of the reporting, what I saw, I was pretty humbled, because I didn't think before I started doing the reporting that, of course, the first question sitting down with people would be, and Eliza, well, what do you believe? And of course that was the first question. And so...
Did you ever not want to answer that question?
Oh, yeah. Well, I never wanted to not answer that question because I wanted to hide what I believed. In fact, most of the most interesting conversations of the book came out of that question.
Were you ever fearful of revealing what you believed?
It would have been safer to... I'm trying to think. It would have been safer in some cases to say I was a more devout Christian than I was. In some cases...
I'll tell you why I asked that. Because I broke the fast once. I'm Jewish. Yom Kippur is the biggest day of the Jewish year. It's the only day that I would ever consider fasting. I broke the fast once in Pakistan, in Islamabad, in a rug shop, and they were breaking their fast for Ramadan. I was way too scared to tell them that I was breaking my fast for Yom Kippur, because I was just thinking Daniel Pearl, Daniel Pearl, Daniel Pearl. So I just wonder if you... I suppose, look, it's a question about journalism and ethics in a way, but it's also about the religion of the people you're speaking to.
Sure.
Was it ever safer to lie about your own beliefs?
No, it was sometimes safer to lie about the fact I was married.
Right. Why?
Because the idea in some places of an unmarried woman traveling on her own was so socially threatening to people that it would turn them off from talking to me.
And endanger your safety as well?
And endanger my safety, yeah. But the idea of being morally implicated in the reporting, especially when it comes to beliefs, I'm about as steeped in it as one can be, partly because I would face situations in which praying with people of extremely different stripes, whether they would be Franklin Graham, one was Franklin Graham, or...
So you prayed with him?
I'm not going to answer that question. You can read it.
Okay.
I sat on the sidelines while some members of Jemaah Islamiyah, an al-Qaeda-linked group responsible for the Bali bombings, these guys prayed. Now, one of the realities of this kind of post-jihad moment that we're in many ways, is that these guys, their international funding had dried up. Now, these are some of the baddest of the bad. These guys had trained in Afghanistan and al-Qaeda-linked camps. And what are they doing now? They are selling Islamic Avon products, essentially. They're selling makeup because there is no more international funding, and to support themselves, they've turned to this different work, but they are who they are. And I sat on a bench with a couple of stray cats while they were praying in the course of an interview. So, now is that somebody... A BBC journalist was asking me the other day, you were with Franklin Graham, and I thought, why are you not asking me? I was with al-Qaeda-linked groups as well. But somehow...
Because the BBC are more scared of him than
they are.
al-Qaeda.
They're more afraid of this sort of evangelical Christian reality that's more offensive. So anyway, I love watching our own prejudices in action, and certainly my own are the place to start.
Look, I'm going to take the chance to diverge again if I can.
Do it.
You're talking about your own religious upbringing. And I find my own understanding of, say, what is going on in the United States, that real push within the Republican Party to identify with church.
Sure.
Do you think we are all, perhaps, because of the way the world is changing at such a rapid rate, and that affects a whole lot of different societies, do you think all societies, from Somalia through to, the Midwest in the United States, it's easier to identify by religion? Did you see any sort of commonality there, that we're moving towards more of a more religious identification than the other things we used to use?
I think we are, because it is the greatest global denominator we have. And now, on the surface of that, now is that frightening? Does that mean that and one of the reasons the book doesn't, the only Jews I dealt with at all in the course of the reporting were a very tiny group in Eritrea who didn't even, they ended up on the editing bay floor because there were just too few and it didn't make any sense. And I kept trying to get into this one synagogue, and it was closed most of the time. But that's a super interesting story of looking at how within the Muslim world, first Jews and now Christians, there really is a very powerful diaspora going on. And the idea of persecution is extraordinarily real.
And is that part of that reversion, perhaps in a lot of places, to a less sophisticated version of Islam? Do you think that's part of the same thing?
I think what's going on to some degree, and I'm going to speak to Christianity and Islam because I'm more comfortable, but I bet there are more parallels in Judaism than I really have an educated perspective on. For the past several decades, there have been religious awakenings, reawakenings happening within both a Christian and a Muslim context. Now, they have certain things in common. They have in common, first and most importantly, the idea that it is possible to have a personal encounter with God. Okay, so Sufi Muslims, who make up the majority of North Africa's Muslims, believe, much as evangelical Christians do, that where you can encounter God through the human heart. That's the most powerful place to encounter God. Now, in many ways, these reawakenings tend to be conservative. Why? Because people believe that once they've had this conversion or reversion experience, they have direct access, unmediated access to their respective religious book without needing a priest or an imam or any interlocutor. So that means if I can read my Bible, I know what's right for me, and by definition, I know what's right for you too. These reawakenings tend to be based on absolute ideas that there is one and only one way to be saved, and they tend to return to an idealized religious past that never really existed. For example, within a Muslim context, we see this insistence in the Salafi, in this kind of returning to the 7th century of short pants, people wearing certain things that maybe people never wore. We certainly have that within a Christian context too. Well, it was like this in Jerusalem. Well, was it? Was there this absolutist trend? No, there wasn't. There have been fractured understandings of what faith has meant for thousands of years. And so I think that is heartening, because this breaking down within what looks like a reawakening and this kind of monolithic encounter on one hand, give it a little more time, and the kind of fracturing that is already there will begin to make itself more evident.
Look, I want to talk about Indonesia, because biggest Muslim nation, but also very interesting to see what has happened there. You were talking before about Jamar Islamiyah, which most Australians associate with the Bali bombings, which is a big experience in our collective consciousness. It's died off in a big way, that group, yet there are really big problems with Muslims fighting Christians in places like Ambon. You talk about the Vice and Virtue Squad in Aceh. What's going on with Islam in Indonesia, and how is it able to... I guess what's interesting about Indonesia is it's able to accommodate so many different versions of Islam.
That's what's going on with Islam in Indonesia. I mean, that there is no such single thing as Islam. There are 35,000 Islams. The same thing is true with Christianity, of course. And one of the gifts of Indonesia, Americans in particular have trouble understanding whether Islam and democracy are compatible. I really hope this doesn't air too much in America. I'm really bashing away here, but and all one needs to say is, why don't you look at the world's largest Muslim country, which is also a democracy, and that's Indonesia. So the same pattern of wind and weather that formed the encounter between Islam and Christianity in Africa drives the trade winds. That same cycle I was talking about. So Christianity and Islam came to compete really over the spice trade, over the same beaches, ports, islands. And that same competition drove an incredibly diverse and vibrant encounter. And so there are pockets. Both Christianity and Islam have these identities in Indonesia of casting off colonialism. I am a Christian, I am a Muslim, and I reject this secular, corrupt civilization, and I return to my idealized religious roots. Certainly that's happening in Aceh, where we see, and again, talk about extreme weather. The tsunami is driven by the same pattern here. So you have people saying, well, we are bringing in, this new and improved form of Islam that's been on the books for quite a long time. And people, I think, so on the surface of that, my God, what's happening in Aceh? Give it 10 years and we will see the breakdown of...
So you think, should just explain those Vice and Virtue Squads are a little bit like what happens in Saudi Arabia, really cracking down on people's social behaviour. You write in the book about people saying if we don't become better Muslims, the tsunami will come again. You think that will get broken down in as little as 10 years?
Because I don't know, do you guys have the Keystone Cops here?
I think most of us have an idea of
the Wayatollah Hizbah is more like the Keystone Cops than any kind of Saudi. These guys they're a mess. They're just a mess. And people don't take them very seriously. And so the lived experience of Sharia law, people are terrified. Well, what does Islamic law mean? Well, take Nigeria. Nigeria is a great case study. The northernmost third of the country has adopted Sharia. And one of the things that people have found, the first man who had his hand lopped off by the governor of Zamfara state, one of the most conservative states, for stealing, turns out he was bribed by the governor to let his hand be cut off. So as people see what exposure to this apparently pristine law actually looks like on the ground, it becomes less attractive and I hope less threatening to the West.
I'm just wondering about the way we receive what is going on in places like Indonesia. I had a friend who was a correspondent in Jerusalem. This must have been the first half of the 2000s, but had a very passionate interest in Indonesia and actually ended up going to Indonesia, covering the Bali bombings, things like that. And he was always asking himself the question, why was his stuff getting run a lot? He'd sort of cover 1 or 2 deaths in the West Bank or a bombing in Israel, something like that. Yet the number of casualties in places like Ambon, where thousands and thousands of people die, I just wonder what you think is going on in our society. If we're more interested in what's going on in the West Bank than, particularly for our society, we're so close to Indonesia. Is that just a hangover because we used to all be focused on the Middle East conflict, or is there something else going on there in America and Australia that we just don't care so much about somewhere like Ambon?
Well, I think we have the base reality of racism, that the closer people look like us, the more we're going to care about how many are killed. I know among those of us who work in Africa a lot, there are a lot of dark calculations about how many Africans have to die per white person, right?
Pub fight in Melbourne's more important than a massacre in Manila.
Absolutely.
That's the sort of cliche here.
Absolutely. Now, I'm interested to hear that for the Jerusalem correspondent, he feels that his work was getting run because my friends in Jerusalem are extraordinarily frustrated.
Well, I guess this is now 8 years ago, so I don't know if that's changed.
Yeah. So what I know, again, poor Americans, they're going to get the short end of the stick tonight because we have very little appetite for foreign news. The Bali bombings were almost uncovered in the U.S. Partly that's just the sheer size of the U.S., which is like Australia, and we just don't seem to get proximity. We are increasingly learning that we are part of a larger global narrative and interwoven system by default. We need to learn that. But that's a hard-won lesson.
I wanted to, I mentioned before, Australia has a very heavy, or has had a very heavy involvement in the police force in Indonesia. Excuse me. We were, of course, out there in the front of the column in 2003 in Iraq. We still have a significant military presence in Afghanistan. I wonder how much the political class's engagement in places like Afghanistan recognises the sort of subtlety you bring out in your book. Do you see much engagement, say, in your Department of Defence? Counterinsurgency was a thing that I was I've reported a lot on. So that's the way the soldiers interact with people on the ground. Do you think there's an appreciation in our police forces, in our armies, for the sort of subtlety and nuance you talk about in your book?
No. There are some places where that's not true. The Philippines is one of the places in which the special forces, particularly the U.S. Special Forces, has done a very fine job of interacting with local people. Now, they're a small number. They speak, there are a variety of languages in the southern Philippines, and the guys who are stationed there, and they are mostly guys, they do speak the local languages. I don't know, many times there's so many factors that go into why are they better there, right? Now, they're not facing a culture that's entirely opposed to them. It's a kind of a friendlier culture. And it's in some ways a softer situation. But I do not think there is the appreciation of... I've had a couple of military people reach out in various capacities about the book, particularly those stationed in the Horn of Africa, who do seem to be a bit more sophisticated. It's, I'm particularly interested in borderlands, and it does seem to be those special forces. Well, certainly it's special forces guys more than anybody else. But those stationed at this kind of outposts of places tend to be more interested in the nuance of culture. Now, is it because they can get out a bit more? They have the time to do so.
They're trained to think more independently as well.
They are. And they also chose, when they were in their training, to learn Tagalog rather than Arabic. They branched out to the edges already.
Look, before I do want to ask you in the end, I guess,
Yeah.
What you feel people got out of that. But I wonder again if one of the reasons we don't get subtlety is the fault of people like me. You're talking about the fact that the American military in the Philippines, I would suggest also the Australian police in Indonesia, a lot of that work's done away from the glare of the media.
Oh, yeah.
Is a lot of the reason people don't see these subtleties coming down to the fact that the media aren't giving people perhaps what they need to understand a country like Nigeria?
Absolutely. The money that even reporting this book required, right? No bureau would have sent me to do one of these stories, probably. And yet, in Nigeria, 50,000 people have died in one of the most underreported stories on the face of the planet. And there's a woman I wrote about in Somalia. Her name's Dr. Hawa Abdi. We were talking about her just before. She shook the first President Bush's hand. She runs a refugee camp with 100,000 people under her own steam. She started a one-room clinic as a legacy of the Cold War. She's a Soviet-trained gynecologist. And in the early 90s, when the famine began in the Horn of Africa, now outdone tenfold by the new famine, but she half opened her clinic, and people just started turning up to Mama Hawa's land. When I was there a couple of years ago for the first time, she and we were walking around this camp. We were walking up a super steep hill, and new arrivals the Somalis live in what they're mostly nomadic, or historically were, and so they were making what looked like upside-down birds' nests, which they were they were fighting over tarps to put on top of these kind of bramble structures. And Dr. Howland, this hill was extremely steep, and she turned to me and she said, "I buried more than 10,000 people under this hill. It was a mass grave." And who paid attention to that? One of the most rewarding pieces of writing this book is that she was nominated for a Nobel Prize this year. And her work is now supported to some degree. Now, does it matter? We all shook Hillary Clinton's hand. She shook President Bush's hand, the first President Bush, and now she has 100,000 people on her camp still. And this Al-Qaeda linked group came last week and took 700 children from the camp to an Al-Qaeda rally. Kidnapped children from this camp last week. And who's reporting on it? Nobody. Something else I wanted to say about Dr. Hawa. She's the most remarkable person I've met in my life. And to go meet her required, that I risked my life a couple of times, and nobody cared about Dr. Hawa. Nobody cared. And then a couple of people started thinking, well, she's remarkable, and then they heard her story from herself, because she tells it much better. And I don't know. Does it make a difference? I don't know. But those are the voices that I hope that we go out and listen to.
And you obviously make the effort to talk about these people, and it really is, it's a series of, it's kind of like a patchwork, because it's little story after little story after little story after little story that makes up a larger picture. If Western reporters aren't doing this, you talk a lot about the people who you go on these journeys with.
Yeah.
Is anybody doing this sort of work in places like Nigeria or Indonesia?
No. No one is doing this sort of, I don't even know what you would call it, kind of long-form reportage. No one's doing it in America either. So my next project is about poverty in America, because it's one of the most underreported stories there is. But I got in a wicked fight with the Associated Press correspondent in Lagos, in Nigeria, years ago, who said, well, this kind of conflict, this kind of line between Christianity and Islam doesn't exist. And I said, well, not in 500 words, but in 50,000 it sure does. But a lot of the stories that I tell in this book, partly because they are extraordinarily sensitive, and many people died after acts of great violence, and there's nothing worse than sensationalizing religion as a source of conflict. And so I think it takes that many words to say, hang on a second, yes, this one called himself a soldier for Christ, this one called himself a soldier for Islam, but they grew up in these circumstances, their parents were this kind of friends. Without the context of a story like this, I think it could be extraordinarily dangerous, because it could feed the wrong kind of fire.
But religion's going to be part of the answer in a lot of these places, isn't it? I mean, Egypt's probably an example many people are familiar with. They may know that I think it's more than half of the parliamentary seats have gone to religious parties. What would you suggest, say, listen, say you've got the year of our new foreign minister, we've got a new foreign minister, or Hillary Clinton's year. How can we help in those countries, and is there anything we can do to help religion be part of the solution in these countries?
Well, without a question, probably the most profound fallout of the Arab Spring, which we haven't seen yet take full form, is not that these are countries that are suddenly embracing democracy. They're suddenly embracing Islamic democracy. And as we've seen where the United States, supported elections in Gaza, and then, Islamic parties won. We were not interested in democracy anymore. The West is going to have to come to terms with what Islamic democracy looks like. And we're going to have to do it fairly soon. So is religion part of the solution? It is, without a question. Because for every one person that stood up and killed his neighbor in the name of his faith, there are 30 million, that's an exaggeration, 30,000 in his town alone, who are quietly coexisting. And it is what we are going to see increasingly with this fracturing within religions is the so-called moderates, the silent majority, is going to stand up increasingly and speak. We see this in the United States where especially around election time, people are damn sick of it. You wouldn't know from a distance, but Rick Santorum's monopoly on what Christianity means or what faith and leadership means has sickened people to such an extent that those who have sat on their couch or quietly gone to church for years are now standing up and trying to figure out how to take the microphone. Now, the truth is, part of both of our implication in this, the media listens to people who speak easily. Sound bites are great copy, and extremists speak in sound bites. So part of it is on these, people always say to me, well, why don't these moderate Muslims speak out? Who's listening? So I think there is both an obligation on the part of the media to listen and on the part of those who are in the moderate majority, no matter what faith, to stand up and speak for what that practice looks like.
Look, before I ask you what, I guess I want to ask you what you would like people to take away from the book, but before I do another small military diversion.
Bring it.
I've got actually some stories coming up in The Age soon that is about the renewed military focus on the Horn of Africa.
Yes.
So there's a huge special forces effort that is swinging from places like Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Horn of Africa. And when it comes to, this book's all about understanding social nuance and subtlety.
Yeah.
And it's actually really about, I guess it's a plea for even the military to get their fingernails dirty and understand what's going on the ground.
Yeah.
But the way your nation is going is there is more and more remote fighting. Your country fights more and more with machines and drones.
Yes.
How do those two, can those two work together? Can you be more subtle if you're dropping bombs from 20,000 feet?
Absolutely not. There's a place that is not in the book, but is the place probably dearest to me in the world, which is Waziristan, a tribal area between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And man, is it an al-Qaeda hotbed. There's no denying that. It would be silly to even say so. At the same time, I was speaking to one of my friend's fathers, a Wazir man, the other night, and he was telling me that the village I was last in 2007...
Should say it's incredibly difficult for a Western reporter to go somewhere like that, but continue.
Yeah, and I ended up with a gun to my head and blindfolded and handcuffed and some of those lovely things that are a part of doing this work. He told me the village is gone. Why? Because American drone strikes have wiped it off the face of the planet. So people ask me a lot about drones. They're really... God, I saw the oddest thing. Sorry to divert myself, but I was in Afghanistan a couple of weeks ago, and I was driving along a highway, and I saw American surveillance blimps, they hang super low off the ground. And that's, talk about postmodern warfare. Forget the soldiers, forget the drone. Just have this blimp looking at everything beneath it.
There's one sitting above the Australian Army base in Afghanistan.
Is there?
Yep, they're everywhere.
Interesting. So does remote warfare lead to cross-cultural understanding? I think it's safe to say no. I have one question for you.
In their defence, though, they do a lot more information gathering on the ground while they are doing the drones.
They do a ton of it, and I have to say that I'm involved in this U.S. bipartisan think tank, and the head of the board of the think tank is the head of Google. And at our annual meeting once, we got to watch Google watching the cameras from a drone strike. We watched 2 strikes. We watched one that was supposed to show how friendly these strikes are, because the camera on the drone goes down. There's a man, he's the target. Oh, he's got his child, veer off. And then we watched another where the man had no child, and the camera went until we got close to the man, and then the camera went blank. I don't know. Do I think it's safer? Drones are a really hard question, and I'm not one to say that there are not people. When people want you dead, do I believe it's okay to fight them? I do. So, yeah. That's it.
Look, I'll leave it there. I was going to ask Eliza to sum up, but perhaps the summary might come in one of your questions, because I'm conscious of time. I want to leave people a chance to put their own questions. So really, if you feel I haven't covered something, if you feel that Eliza's perhaps skated over something, there are 2 microphones there and there, so just raise your hand if you've got a question. There's one just down there.
Thank you. I'm interested in any experiences you've had with the Wahhabi sect in those areas, and what they're doing. Mm-hmm.
So the Wahhabi sect being a name that we use to really look at what we probably call these days more often Salafist Islam, which are Salafi means companion. And it's a reference to those first followers who were surrounding the Prophet Muhammad when he was alive, and that's really what Wahhabism means, to re-embody Islam as it looked, smelled, tasted in the 7th century. Now, one of the things we certainly see, we know this now, sort of vaguely this narrative from Afghanistan and Pakistan, is that the Saudi government, working hand in hand with religious leaders, exported this form of Islam around the world and continues to do so, especially in North Africa, and it's got a lot of money behind it. So it's popular in places where money is required. I've seen it in a lot of places. You can find these guys, and they are missionaries. They do frequently call themselves missionaries. Everywhere from Somalia, from Mogadishu, to northern Nigeria, to New York City. It is part of what globalized Islam looks like, and it is particularly frightening to many Westerners because it speaks to a real other. And, women embrace it too. And wearing the niqab, wearing gloves as a form of purdah is supposedly a restoration of this kind of religion. Now, one of the most interesting pieces of it, because one of the questions I began with in reporting this book is, does fundamentalism, whether it's Christian or Muslim, inherently lead to violence? Because if there is one and only one way to find God, then everybody who doesn't believe what you believe is lost at best or an enemy, an evil at worst. So since this kind of Islam is particularly guided in one direction, is it inherently violent? That's one of the questions I asked in the course of the reporting, and the answer is no. Because even within this very hardline sect of Islam, there are further fractures. And many of those who are most devout to this form of Islam don't believe that any kind of violence in the name of Islam is okay today on the face of the planet. They are pacifists. Why? Because there is no caliph. There is no single Islamic leader who can legalize and declare holy war. And therefore, any kind of holy war in the name of Islam is inherently political and inherently forbidden because it's not religious. So those are the kind of distinctions that I feel it's important to learn. Not to say, oh, it's okay, everybody can believe what they can believe. It's that can be dangerous as well. But to understand the very different textures within what looks like a monolithic, terrifying thing at a distance.
Saw some Wahhabi mosques in Bosnia as well.
Yeah.
So they're kind of everywhere. Anybody else got a particular concern or a query? Look, I might just ask... I'm assuming most people haven't bought the book. It's at the back there if people do want to buy a copy.
That,
I'm sure
Rafael.
Eliza will be there to sign a copy if you like. What do you want people to get from the book? What do you want me to go away with after I've finished it?
I want you to go away profoundly troubled. No,
I already am.
Fantastic. I want you to go away knowing that the most important religious struggles of our time are inside religions, not between them. And that's particularly relevant right now with the American election cycle coming up, because Franklin Graham, the man with whom I went to Sudan, he was famous when I traveled with him in 2003 for calling Islam wicked and evil. And that was an opinion he formed in Sudan, where the modern world's bloodiest self-proclaimed jihad among Christians and Muslims alike was in fact waged. This is a truth. It's an uncomfortable truth, and we need to face it. But Franklin Graham is more well known now for saying that President Obama is not a true Christian. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, he hit the airwaves with this thing. President Obama is not a true Christian. This man has millions of Christian followers. Graham does, and so I called him and I asked, what are you talking about? You believe that somebody who makes a declaration for Christ is by definition a Christian. Who are you to say that President Obama, who says he's made this decision for Christ, is not a legitimate Christian? His answer to me was that President Obama was the softest leader we'd had on Islam. So when we see something like the fight at the World Trade Center site over an Islamic cultural center, that's a struggle inside of Christianity. That's a struggle inside of politics over who has the right to speak for God, liberals or conservatives. It has very little to do with Islam. And this is a question we see more and more in the run-up to the 2012 elections.
There you go, the 2012 elections, the divisions inside Christianity. Oh, I'm sorry, is there another question down the back there before we finish? Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you about that particular issue in terms of the problems within the religions forming a greater issue here rather than between. We had a speaker last week here. His name is Alam Shah. He's a former Muslim who wrote a book on called The Young Atheist's Handbook. And it's a beautiful book, and it's written in a really reasonable and almost loving tone. He has no problem with anyone who believes whatsoever. He's just a very reasonable man. And one of the things he said that really struck me was he grew up in a Bangladeshi community, and he, like most Muslims, didn't understand the words that they were given to recite, because it seems that most Muslims actually don't speak Arabic and they're required to recite the lines without understanding them. And I wonder whether that forms some of the lines of problems within the Islamic community itself, if the people aren't physically able to understand some of the things they're reading.
It's certainly a factor. Within Islam, one of the most highly prized scholarly roles to have is to be hafiz, which is to know the Quran by heart. And that does not require at all understanding. Now, this is, you could speak not one literal word of Arabic, you could learn the Quran by heart and you would be hafiz, which would mean authority, an authority. So the schisms and fights going on within Islam right now ask this very question. There are those on every side who say, so any version of the Quran that is not in Arabic is called an interpretation. It cannot be, I don't know if he spoke to that, it cannot be a translation, because if it's not Arabic, it's not legitimate. Now, This reinforces, we were speaking a little bit before about this Wahhabi or Salafi tradition within Islam. This reinforces this superiority of the Arabian Peninsula in the understanding of who's a true Muslim and who's not. One of my favorite people on earth is a progressive Muslim scholar. His name is Abdullahi Anaim. He's a professor. He's a Sudanese scholar. And he says that the future, if you want to think about the future of Islam, he actually says explicitly, look to its borderlands. Look to the 10th parallel, look to Indonesia, because it's there where the population is growing the fastest and the most diverse interpretations of the faith are growing the fastest, not in the so-called Saudi heartland where Islam is taking its future forms. And I find that to be really exciting and interesting. And to some degree that speaks to that kind of inherent racism of, okay, if you don't speak Arabic, you're not a true Muslim, which stands at the heart of a lot of that, who speaks the language and who is the most devout by definition. We see this within Al-Qaeda itself, and certainly within Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia. A lot of the former terrorists are quite pissed off that they were treated so shabbily by their Arab brothers. They were seen as second-class citizens within the Al-Qaeda organization, and for many that was enough for them to break out as somehow not as legitimate Muslims because they were not Arabs. And that's certainly something both the Australian and the American counterinsurgency has tried to exploit. You know, oh, look at your divisions within. So if that helps to answer that a bit.
Thank you, Eliza. Appreciate that elucidation and explanation. I'd like to thank you all for coming along. I'd like to thank the Wheeler Centre as well. My name's Rafael Epstein from ABC Radio. Eliza Griswold will be at the back of the room. Thank you to the Wheeler Centre and have a pleasant evening.
Thank
See you
you.
later.